Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Dan Ball and welcome to another episode of the Wellness Academy podcast. Here at the Wellness Academy, it is my job to distill all things wellness, an attempt to break down from all our different coaches, experts and guests their wisdom and knowledge so you can apply it to your own life. Our guest today is Alan Flanagan. Alan is a lawyer and a nutritionist based in Dublin, Ireland, and he was put in touch with me by one of our previous guests, Sophie Medlin. If you haven't listened to that one, please check it out. It was a super cool interview and she was somebody who I very much enjoyed speaking to. So on the strength of that recommendation, I got in touch with Alan, who is also currently pursuing a master's in nutritional medicine at the University of Surrey. He was an extremely interesting guy to speak to. I got the opportunity to really quiz him on some ins and outs of nutrition that I personally have been interested in over the last several years. This one was a very, very, very interesting, I say intellectual, but really smart conversation, something I really got a kick out of doing. So thank you, Alan, again for coming on. And as always, you guys, please enjoy. Listen wherever you find your podcasts, on YouTube, on Apple, on Spotify. Hopefully you found us by now, and we will see you on the next one. So, Alan, welcome to the Wellness Academy podcast. I think I was meant to say thank you very much for coming on the show and combine those two together. But thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me on.
As we were just saying before I pressed record, it was Sophie Medlin that recommended that I speak to you. So kind of off the back of her recommendation, I reached out to yourself. But kind of intentionally haven't done a significant amount of delving into you as a person and what you're about, etc., etc.
Right.
With the idea that I had an awesome conversation with her. If she recommended speaking to you, I feel like that's a very trustworthy recommendation. So can you give us a bit of a bio, like what it is that you're up to on a daily basis? What's your
daily basis? So I'm currently a PhD researcher at the University of Surrey, and my area of study right now is timing of food intake and how that influences our health. And the background to that, and the reason there's an interest in this whole question right now, is all organisms, humans in particular, but every organism on the planet has these internal rhythms in our biology that correspond to the 24-hour day. So daily Earth's rotation, cycle of light and darkness, and we have these internal rhythms that correspond to certain behaviors. So there's been a lot of interest in that area since the 1960s, but in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of interest in how those rhythms actually are also quite responsible for your response to food intake, how well you tolerate blood glucose, for example. Your response to carbohydrate meals is going to differ early versus later in the day and stuff like that. So that's what we're studying at the minute. My background, though, prior to this was a bit of a meander to nutrition science. I started out Isn't
that what everyone does? A meander to what they do. I'm finding when
so.
I'm talking.
I think so. Yeah, I started out on a humanities path. Like I did history and English as my undergrad, and then I did law afterwards. I kind of knew doing my undergrad I wanted to go on to law, and so I qualified in 2009, got called to the bar in Ireland, practiced as a barrister for 9 years. And then my side interest was always nutrition and the kind of science and research side of it. And so I started looking to do courses in my spare time, just out of interest. I eventually did an MSc program at
it says so much about the person that you are, that you're a barrister and just out of interest. Let's really, okay.
Right. Yeah. So out of interest decided, and then it led me to this master's in nutrition science at the University of Surrey, which you could do modular. So I did that while I was still working in law. And then by the time I got to the end of that MSc, it had really crystallized for me that I really wanted to try and go on and get into research. And this current PhD program that I came on became available, and it was kind of the type of project that I really couldn't refuse. It was a study in humans. It was very tightly controlled lab study. It was all these variables that you don't often get the opportunity to do in nutrition as a PhD. You might get to do it further down the line. Mm-hmm. So it was very much a clear decision to what to do with, and I left law last year and started full time into nutrition research, and here I am.
How has that been?
Great. Yeah. It's been great. It's everything that happened over the past kind of year just validated the decision. It's been brilliant to be involved with. It was great that I got to stay at Surrey as a nutrition research science institute. It's fantastic. The research they do there, the academics they have there is brilliant. It's a really rich environment. And so, I feel like I owe a lot to the university, but in a positive way, because it's not often that, as a lawyer with a humanities background, you would get an opportunity to get onto an MSc program that requires a biosciences background, which I didn't have. Right. And they took that chance, and hopefully I'm repaying them.
Was it a tough decision to leave something that's obviously you invested so much of yourself to get into, to then do something very, very different?
What was it tough? I think the practicalities of it are what's tough, because you're weighing up leaving, full-time employment where you have an income and all these things. And, it's more the life side of things that you question in terms of, is this the right thing to do at this time? You're walking away from a bit of security and those kind of things. It's more those things. But when you step back from those practicalities, which can also work themselves out in the fullness of time, and you just look at the actual decision itself and what's best to do, that was clear cut. Like, that was night and day for me. It had just, particularly when I was doing my dissertation for my MSc, and that was my first real taste of actually doing your own research, and you just get kind of bitten by a bug, and I had to give it that shot, and it would have been worse not taking the shot and then living with second guessing that decision, right?
Cool. So I guess I don't know, not the average listener. Time restricted eating or timed eating as such. So very much I enjoy listening to podcasts. Now I enjoy doing them. And it's Rhonda Patrick has been my main
source
of information, I guess, when it comes to that. And one of the things that's been quite interesting about listening to her is she likes to talk about a lot of things which are quite easily accessible in terms of making changes to one's health. So I first heard about her when she started talking a lot about sauna benefits. That's easy. If I've got access to a sauna,
I can sauna.
Go in the sauna and see if what it does. Do you know what I mean? And with the sauna in particular, I feel like maybe some of the benefits she talks about, I don't know whether or not I personally find them a little bit more under the radar than obvious.
Right, and that would be fairly
immediately. Yeah, but some of the stuff she talks about, it's like that. I won't know. I can't do like a sliding doors thing and watch myself taking the actions of going in the sauna and see what happens over there, and not go in the sauna and look at what happens over there to give myself the decision. I just choose to go in the sauna, and I'll never know what would have happened to my life if I didn't.
Exactly.
But there are apparently significant benefits to going in the sauna.
Rhonda Patrick very much focuses on very kind of molecular level. This protein pathway is activated by the sauna. It's like, you don't know whether that's going on or not. Exactly. It's like, is my AMP kinase activated? So it's like, how do you know that, right? You don't. And so you're very much putting your trust in the fact that intervention is going to have the outcome. I think for me, one thing that I'm always kind of from a scientific standpoint careful to kind of differentiate between is, a lot of those studies, whether it's sauna or whether it's nutrition, often they're done in animal models.
They are, yeah.
Often they're just looking at a mechanistic pathway. And we can't always necessarily assume that a mechanism equals an effect, particularly in real life or in human systems, so to speak. And so I think it's one of those things where you see what's in the research and then you kind of ask yourself, right, is there going to be any harm to me doing this? Is there any harm for me sitting in a sauna for half an hour? Well, as long as I stay hydrated and do all of those things, then the answer is no, more than likely. And so, yeah, could you do it if you have access to it? Yeah, fine.
I first heard about her on Tim Ferriss's blog, and he's the same kind of thing. Like he earned my trust when I did the slow carb diet from the 4 Hour Body.
Yes,
and I lost 49 pounds in 4 months.
Wow.
And it changed my life, basically. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I've thoroughly enjoyed his podcast, less so recently, because he's kind of gone in a direction that's very specific to him, and they're not always people I'm like, I've never heard of that person.
Right.
Which I'm beginning to learn is it doesn't matter about the person, it matters what they talk about. So maybe I should just listen to it. But he's had people recommend things before where it's like, for example, in Tools of Titans, he had a lady called Amelia Boone on there.
Yes.
You heard of her?
Yeah, I've had Tools of Titans.
Okay. And she recommends rolling the bottom of your feet on a ball.
And getting
hamstring flexibility. Yes, right? And I'm like, well, if I roll my feet on a ball and it hurts, I need to roll my feet on a ball because your muscles shouldn't be painful to compression. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And what's the worst thing that happens? It hurts a bit and my feet feel a bit better and I get better foot health. I may as well try that, right? Buying a ball and doing that is just a bit of time investment, isn't it?
Right.
But then, for example, some of the supplements that are recommended, I've bought them. I haven't necessarily felt like I've noticed a difference. So when it comes time to reinvest in them, I choose not to. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the sauna, if it's having these amazing benefits or not, I don't know. But I do know I really enjoy sitting in there.
Right.
I feel great.
Right.
And if I combine that with doing like the cold plunge pool, there are times where I just, oh my God,
you feel incredible.
Liberating feel you get.
Yeah.
How would I not do it as long as I'm willing to invest in the place the sauna?
Right,
you know
exactly. I mean? And so that's where we get into a nice, an important distinction for people is that, even if what you're doing, and we could call this intervention, so to speak, anything. It could be sauna, it could be something you do with your diet, it could be a supplement. If you do it and it gives you some degree of subjective feel good factor, going in a sauna and jumping in a cold pool makes you physically feel better, more rejuvenated, and all of those things. Then even if all of these crazy protein pathways aren't being activated, that's probably serving you. That's probably serving you in that moment a little more than whatever mechanistic pathways in a rat might respond to sauna. And then the second thing is that it's also then important that we don't and this is a real tendency in the conversations about health, particularly online. And I say health broadly, again, whether it's nutrition or any kind of sort of health intervention, is people who adopt a certain practice and feel that it benefits them can often become quite moralistic about that particular practice. And suddenly, we're making people feel bad because they're not sauning twice a day, and that's a big barrier in the wider discourse about healthcare right now. So I think it's really important that we're always stepping back to realize if something benefits us on some sort of subjective level, and it's not the kind of thing that everyone just has ubiquitous access to.
Which is, I'm very fortunate that a really, really nice spa hotel is down the road.
Lovely.
They've just put their prices up quite significantly. So the reason why I mention if I choose to continue to invest in it, because I don't know if it is making the difference that Rhonda Patrick says that it is.
Yes.
I'm less inclined to stick with this place. When I'm suffering with a bit of a bad back, when that's fixed, probably will make the choice to go to my local CrossFit gym because I enjoy CrossFit training in that environment more than I enjoy spending the money to go in the sauna and the plunge pool and do normal gym training. So at the minute, I try and make full use of it because there's supposedly a lot of benefits to it. And
it can also go the other way as well, right? I mean, I compete in powerlifting. It's a sport. It's a sport I love. But I'm 35. I played rugby my whole life, and there are times when I'm in the gym and I'm just, I constantly have like, I've a hip niggle, I've a bit of tendonitis in my bicep, so I have stuff constantly that I'm dealing with. And I could really pathologize that and say, oh my God, I'm in pain, I shouldn't do this. But even the little bits of pain and usually it's just a case of getting on the foam roller, doing a bit more mobility work and that kind of thing. But even that little bit of, shall we say, negative feedback in no way outweighs the positive feedback that I get from enjoying the training and the sport.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, man.
so
100%.
yeah, so it's just
There's
like,
a couple do a little plug for the podcast, my podcast. So you mentioned about being interested in powerlifting. I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing a guy called Lawrence Charley, who is a world strongman competitor, former Britain's and Europe's strongest man. So his podcast episode I'm going to be putting out Saturday.
That's excellent.
And then he put me in touch with Robert Kearney. Robert Kearney is another world strongman finalist. And he is on Instagram as the world's strongest gay. So he's the only openly gay strongman. So his Instagram is the world's strongest gay, and he was a super cool guy.
Yeah.
And then literally just this morning interviewed a guy called Tom Merrick, who's on Instagram and YouTube as the Bodyweight Warrior. So he's all about end range strength and mobility and flexibility, like handstand master. Do you know what I mean? So three really cool people. If you get a chance while you're on your Christmas break,
I will do, definitely.
Try and listen to that. Would be cool. So speaking of, you mentioned about how Rhonda's stuff is, again, I have this thing where if I can try it and I can give it a go and there's not going to be any serious negative consequences to me trying it, if somebody that I trust, quote unquote, do you know what I mean? Like, I says something, I'll give it a go. So her stuff though, I don't understand what she's talking about, right? It sounds cool, and I feel like
I think a lot of people
like the animal models.
Yes.
I have noticed that all of her stuff, maybe not. I might be. Probably
a majority of it would be
mice, it's this and it's that, and we know that can't necessarily be compared to humans, of course.
Yeah.
They're making guesswork, I guess.
They're over extrapolating. My thing with Rhonda is, and I was put on to Rhonda Patrick, not unlike yourself, via Tim Ferriss. I generally liked her, like you said, it's like, here's my micronutrient smoothie.
That was the first thing
a lot of people can make that, right? Mm-hmm. Get your stuff, toss it in the blender, blend this shake. If 90% of the population did that, their health would dramatically improve, and just did that alone. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what she kind of came out with as far as advice for things to do was, I thought, like you said, quite practical. But with a lot of her deeper kind of health, her stands on a lot of different issues, she's far too reliant on animal models. And, we know that a lot of the time, the pathway might be similar, but it doesn't mean that the effect is the same in humans, particularly when it comes to diet stuff. Because if you do time-restricted feeding in a rat or a mouse, they're quite small organisms. Their responsiveness to big changes in their diet is quite dramatic. Human responsiveness is not. So if you do a 30% energy deficit in a mouse, that's an enormous energy deficit for an organism of that size. If you do a 30% energy deficit in humans, it's not that big of a deal. It's about 500 calories less than your maintenance. Most people could do that. Yeah. So for me, she really over relies on animal models to kind of make these fairly complicated health claims. And so I still dip in and out of her content, but I'm just much more scientifically skeptical now.
Well, I remember learning about time-restricted eating because of her. Mm-hmm. I can't remember which one I heard of first, whether it was, so there's a fasting app called Zero, which again, via Tim Ferriss, I think is it Kevin Rose might do Zero. Maybe. And it's like an app where you can pick circadian rhythm, you can pick your own version, so you can do 16-8, you could do 20 hours fasting, 4 hours eating, you could do like 13-11, 14-10, whatever you want.
Right.
And she was the first one I'd heard sort of talk about that. So when I lost all that weight doing the slow carb diet, got in a relationship, and was steadily putting some of it back on, like, you know, the whole comfort weight.
Comfort eating.
Yeah. And like arrested that change with a combination of getting back into training by going to some PT at a CrossFit gym and then joining the CrossFit gym itself. But I also did at the time, I call it intermittent fasting. Like, I know some people love to pick apart the idea of intermittent fasting. All you're really doing is not eating, they'll say. Like, why'd you have to give it a posh name? But at the same time, I think wouldn't eat anything till 10 or 11. I'd break my fast with coffee, and I did the bulletproof coffee thing for a little while, and then would try and not eat after like 8 p.m. if I could do so. Do you know what I mean? And again, I found a lot of benefit to that. Like, probably it's just that I was calorie restricted. I don't know.
Yeah.
But your area of study is
so
this?
Yes.
Topic.
And the university have done a couple of really nice pilot studies in humans, looking at time restricted eating. So the main difference between intermittent fasting and time restricted feeding or eating, just for listeners, is intermittent fasting doesn't consider the circadian rhythm component. It's solely concerned with a restriction of that window. But that could mean not eating at all during the day and eating within a 4-hour window between, 8 and midnight, right? And in the intermittent fasting constructs, when you eat is largely irrelevant. Now, we don't think that is probably ideal. Yes, if your caloric restriction is, kind of maintained over the long term, you'd probably have less negative health effects, but we can't override biology either. And the circadian rhythms that we have in humans for breaking down the food we eat are very much largely amplified to the early part of the day. And so in humans, the daytime is the light phase and is the waking phase and is the active phase, and it's also the period of feeding. Now, in rodents, that's not the case. They're nocturnal animals. So they sleep during the day, they get up during the night. So their nighttime is their active and feeding period. So that's one issue to consider when a lot of these studies are going on in rats and mice. In humans, the thing about circadian rhythms at the most simple level is they're all about stark contrasts. So if the daytime is our waking and active and food consumption period, the nighttime is the polar opposite of that. It's the resting, inactive, fasting phase.
Yeah.
And so all of our systems internally gear towards that period of the evening. And that landscape has been largely changed in the last 100 odd years, but particularly magnified in the last 30 years by artificial light at night. People stay up later. They're exposed to an intensity of light through electronic devices that we would generally only get during the day. And often then during the daytime, people simply are spending the majority of their time in enclosed buildings. And then if you add in where we live, so you're in the UK, I live in the UK, I'm back in Ireland now for Christmas.
Yeah. Cloud.
Right? It's cloudy and it's dark. Now, interestingly, if you were to go outside today and get an hour of outdoor light exposure, you would still, even though it's overcast, get enough of an overall light exposure that your circadian system would know, hey, it's daytime. The problem
does it not know through a window?
It's more. What it's to do is to do with your eyes have very specialized cells that detect light, and the only thing they do is detect light, and they relay that information about light to a special place in the brain that then works all of these systems downstream from that. The problem is, although subjectively you can look out the window and go, hey, it's overcast, or hey, it's blue sky, it's actually the intensity of light in the room itself. And light internally is often significantly less than light externally, because it's about how much of the light globally hits your eyes.
It's also being absorbed, isn't it, by all the colours in the room? Like, it's, this black computer monitor behind my laptop is absorbing all that light, which basically it steals some of the light that could be going through my eyes. Is that correct?
Pretty much, just to conceptualize this because often this can sound quite abstract. So lux is a measure of the intensity of light, right? So the minimum that we need for the circadian system to be like, oh, hey, it's daytime, like active, all this kind of stuff, is about 2,000, look, 1 to 2,000 lux. Probably about 2,000 would be better. And anything above that, you would get that even on an overcast day if you were outside during daylight hours. Average internal lighting in an enclosed building is 500 lux. So there's a big difference, even though subjectively you might think, oh, I have the overhead lights on in the room and it's quite bright. For all of these factors that influence the intensity and wavelength of light in the room, it's not comparable to what you would get outside, even on an overcast day. And so all of these rhythms are basically are just vital for human health. We're starting to realize how important they are, not just for how you process food, but like for your sleep-wake cycle, for mental health. Like the impact of light exposure on mood is quite significant. So all of these things are really important. So time-restricted feeding takes into account these circadian variables. So for time-restricted feeding, most of the protocols are looking at earlier time-restricted feeding.
Before you get onto the feeding thing, because I don't want to interrupt like any of your significant train of thoughts and stuff, but I do want to just quickly ask. So in terms of benefits from actual daylight, so the mental benefits, the benefit, like the impact on feeding, etc. What's my go-to as a minimum? I need to be outside experiencing actual daylight each day.
So bearing in mind that when we give these kind of recommendations, I think practicality for people is always a big one. I try and say 30 minutes to an hour.
So if you were to say, like, let's say, for example, you look at two people. One person is somebody that spends a lot of their time in an office. So they've got to be at work for somewhere in the regions between 7 and 9 a.m.
Right.
And they're not leaving that office till, let's say, between 4 and 7 p.m. So let's say there's a possibility that someone's in an office for 12 hours a day, 5 days a week. And you live in England. So like now, my watch tells me what time the sun's going down. It's 8 minutes to freaking 4. Yeah. And then it's not coming up until like 8:15. Like the days are small right now here.
Right.
So that would be 30 minutes might be really tough for that person to get.
So
but if you flip side that and you say, I'm a person who's quite lucky to work I teach martial arts, I work in an evening. In the daytime, if the weather was nice, I could do this podcast outside.
Right.
How much, if I was going to go, well, I'm already lucky, so 30 minutes is a piece of cake. What would be the opposite end of that spectrum? 30 minutes minimum, and then how much would be amazing for me?
I mean, amazing would be probably 3 hours plus. Okay. And I say that because we know from some research that for every 30 minutes you spend outdoors, your internal rhythms advance in a positive sense. So the more you would spend time outdoors, everything would become slightly earlier in its timing. You would probably have tiredness earlier in the evening. You would sleep earlier. You would wake earlier, and so everything would kind of come forward a little bit. What I do say, so the person you described there that doesn't really have the ability because of work reasons is probably most of the population. Mm-hmm. So what I typically recommend for this time of year, between October and March, certainly, is, and they're pretty freely accessible now on Amazon or eBay, are these little blue light boxes. And they're just little box, probably kind of the size of both your palms together, and they emit blue light. And you could have it just to the side of your laptop while you're having coffee in the morning before leaving to work. Generally about 30 or 45 minutes of exposure to that. You don't have to look straight at it. Your eyes will pick up on the light. So they're really good, and people really notice a big benefit in terms of just even their energy levels. They feel a bit more perked up. And because light is physiologically arousing in humans in a positive sense. So they feel better mood. They're the same kind of lamps that would be used for people with seasonal affective disorder, for example.
My girlfriend discusses whether or not she's got that, because like she's significantly affected by, it doesn't bother me as much. Like, yeah, I'm happier when the sun's out. Like, I love the blue sky. Yeah. But the grey doesn't really fuss me. But it makes her sad.
Yeah. So seriously, honestly, consider one of those lamps. They used to be really niche, and the only one on the market was a Philips one that was £250, and now they're much more
Do you like any one in particular?
I personally like the Philips one, but to be honest, that's just because I got it ages ago and I still have it, and it's great. But there are other brands doing them for much cheaper.
What would I search on Amazon? Blue light box.
Yeah, blue light box. Yeah, blue light. Yeah. So I recommend them for people that have to spend a lot of time indoors. But also that person that you described there, they get to the office between 7 and 9, and they're working away. If they take a coffee break at 10:30, just pull on the jacket and just go for a walk around the block. Even if you've had your little blue light that morning, still try and maximize maximize your light exposure during daylight hours, basically, is generally my advice. And then, because everything in the circadian kind of system is a contrast, the other thing, we can't talk about getting the light exposure early in the day if we don't talk about minding your light exposure in the evening. And that's a really big one, because we can do all of this. We can have our blue light in the morning, and we can try and get outdoors for 30 minutes when we take a coffee break, even if we're working in an office and that kind of thing. But if we come home and sit in front of a 60-inch plasma on our phone, WhatsApping while we're reading a Kindle, and we just have this
me at night, have you?
bombardment of screen time, then it's kind of all for naught. We're basically still sending the same signals, but in the period right before we want to go to bed. Mm-hmm. So what I typically generally advise is for people that do use a laptop in the evening, and there's a free software called Flux that you can download, and you just put in the time zone that you're in, and when it's sunset in your time zone, it will take the blue light out of your screen, so the screen will go orange. It's annoying that you have to jailbreak an iPhone if you want to get the same. But iPhone are bringing in.
Curious question about that, actually. Yeah, because I was briefly using a Whoop band, and one of the things again, it's anecdotal. Do you know what I mean? It's just personal to me. But I feel like I noticed that if I read a book, as in an actual paper book, before bed, it used to tell me I slept better. And I wore it for quite a long time, so it tracks this data. Whereas it would ask you in the morning, did you read, brackets, not on a screened device? So my iPhones, they now have night mode or whatever it is.
Yes.
So the screen goes orange.
Mm-hmm.
Does that still count? Is that okay? Because I don't know if it is.
Right. So there's question marks. I was at a conference last year where a group that are doing a lot of work on this issue, like light and screen stuff, where we're basically saying that it's not just the blue light, so to speak. It's also the intensity of light.
Yes.
So even if an iPhone does go orange, it's the fact that the proximity of the screen to your eyes is generally quite close with the phone, as opposed to even a TV, which would be further away. So I think there's generally those two considerations when we're talking about light exposure, is not just the actual exposure from the device, but it's actually the proximity to the retina as well. And so that's important to consider. Like the glasses you're wearing now, for example, there are companies that are starting to develop kind of clear lens glasses that block a degree of blue light. Then there's the ones that block all sorts of blue, of that kind of light. They're orange tinted. People are less inclined to buy them because they look like a dork. But
what's also going to happen, I can guarantee you, having worn these since I was 3 years of age,
right?
That'd just be another thing where they'll stack the price on. I mean, these were, for me personally, these were expensive.
Oh, if you're getting them,
because I'm quite blind.
Right. So you need them to be prescription lens as well.
Yeah. And then you just talk and it's anti-reflection is pretty standard as a coating for glasses now, but you still have to pay for it.
So that I'm
distracted by light bouncing off the glasses into my eyes, and I'm like, what's that? And so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I've got quite a high prescription, so then blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Speaking of glasses, you talk about in the daytime. So I've come to not suffer, because it's not suffering, I guess, but got quite bad floaters in my vision.
Right.
It's basically where the jelly of your retina hardens, so light can't pass through. So when you look around, you've got floating bits. So in the summer, they can be very, very, very distracting, and I wear my sunglasses a lot. How much effect does that have on my overall health? essentially living in a darkened environment for, I mean, granted, we don't get a lot of sun, but it's like, if the sun's out, my sunglasses are on, even in the house, you know, because the floaters are so, oh God, yeah, the floaters are so bad.
Right.
Just every time I see them, my brain goes, you're going to go blind. Do you know what I mean? They're quite distracting. Like, what kind of effect does that have on me?
Well, I mean, it does have an effect because you're blocking the kind of light that you want to get at that point in the day. You know, so you're essentially creating, you know, a light, you know, an artificial light environment in the opposite sense. So yeah, so the light thing for me is the most fascinating aspect of all of this research. I think there are a lot of unknowns yet. I know that there's a group at the University of Manchester that are trying to develop, is it Manchester? Anyway, but they presented some of their preliminary kind of data at one of the conferences last year, but they're trying to develop screens that will not emit that kind of like particular spectrum and intensity of light, but without changing the picture quality. Okay. So that's the big challenge, because no one wants to sit there looking at an orange TV, right? So the big challenge I think tech will provide a lot of solutions to these issues. And yeah, exactly. And it's a very adaptive industry, and it responds to need, and it has the capacity to do so. So I do think that tech will give us a lot of answers. But it's just funny that the research indicates that, for example, even if we expose two people to the same kind of intensity of light, and one of it's through an artificial, say, light box, and the other is through outdoor light exposure, the outdoor light exposure has a greater effect on your circadian system. And so when it comes to light exposure, it doesn't really seem like at this point there is a substitute for simply being outdoors. But again, the practicalities of that in modern life are what they are. And so I think using a blue light box is a very good step that people can take, while also just trying to sneak out during the day for a walk around the block and a coffee, you know.
It is kind of funny that we talk about, like, I don't know, like, part of me thinks to myself, you know, we'll call it, yes, it's not practical if you live in England and for a percentage of the year there's not a lot of sunlight, and you work during those sunlight hours. But I mean, come on, just talking about going outside, like, it's not
about going outside.
Smokers
talking about going outside.
Have a cigarette break. They stand there through wind, snow, sleet, hail,
Right.
whatever, have a cigarette. And those of us that don't do something that damages our health are like, oh no, it's too cold to go out. Just essentially, come on, just suck it up and stand outside. I'm going to tell myself that when I come off this podcast. By the way, it's cold, but I'm going to walk to the shop to go get some daylight. So much cool stuff I can ask you. I was pleasantly surprised when I talked to Sophie, and I'm more than pleasantly surprised talking to you about the cool things I get to ask you. Like, what does this do? Like, so I do a lot of CrossFit, and some of the world's best CrossFitters, particularly the females, are Icelandic, and they'd laugh at us if we complained about daylight for certain parts of their year. Like, how does that work? Like, how can some of the fittest women on earth be managing to deal with that when they live, like?
Well, true. I think two things. One, the Scandinavians generally are really proactive about this kind of research. Like, they were the first countries really recommending light boxes generally. Like, they're all over this stuff, because as much as they genetically are, it seems, quite predisposed to excellence in strength sports, Iceland has the highest number of strongmen, I think, competing internationally per capita. Like, so there's definitely that, you know, that genetic influence on sport that we know is a big influence on kind of sport in different countries. You know, like the Kenyans don't produce strongmen, they produce distance runners, right? So there's definitely a genetic factor there, but I think it's also important to remember that they do in those countries. You know, the Scandinavian countries have historically dealt with really high levels of seasonal affective disorder and depression in the winter, and really high levels of alcoholism. So as much as they have wonderful societies, you know, they still have not been immune from these issues. Okay. You get the opposite end then in the summer there. It just doesn't get dark, right? Like the more north you are, I have friends that did a cycle trip a few years ago where they were up in northern Alaska in June, and the sun only ever set to the horizon and came up again. Or even 18 hours of every day. So yeah, definitely the Scandinavians are not immune from, the impact of light on physiology. They've just been a lot more proactive with kind of recommending people take action on it in light of what the research shows. And so they're very much they're very proactive when it comes to the winter component of their seasonal cycles. Yeah.
What so getting back towards where we were kind of originally going, things from a food perspective and
Yes.
like timed eating. If let's say I'm sat here and I'm going, right, so at the minute there's multiple reasons why, but I'm kind of following a little bit of I would call it intermittent fasting. I don't think I'd call it time restricted eating, because I think if I'm going to do time restricted eating, there's going to be a little bit more intelligence to what I'm doing. Really, I'm just not having anything till like 10, have a coffee, then eat kind of 11 or 12, and trying to limit how much I eat in an evening, because obviously it's dark. And like when I used to use the Zero fasting app, it would tell you how many hours you ate in like dark hours. So I kind of took from that you should limit how much eating you do when it's dark.
Yeah.
From the circadian rhythm perspective. So can you just at this point in the podcast summarize maybe 3 to 5 things or actionable takeaways for me, for anybody else? What would we do and why would we do it?
Right. Absolutely. So one of the things about time restricted feeding that has been in the early kind of human studies quite positive is that it seems really accessible to people. So one of the researchers at Surrey did a study during her PhD where she got women who were just living their normal lives, and all she got them to do was delay when they had breakfast by 90 minutes and bring forward from when they usually had dinner by 90 minutes. So they condensed their daily eating window by 3 hours, 90 minutes on either end.
Yeah.
She didn't ask them to do anything different with their diet, change anything, reduce energy intake or anything. And they had really significant improvements in, like, they lost a lot of like belly fat, which is often that kind of like the fat around the middle is the kind of problematic fat, over 12 weeks without changing anything with their diet. So they simply, because they shortened their window, they ended up consuming less food during the day. So they reduced their energy intake and had these kind of improvements in certain, they had kind of good improvements, I think, if I recall as well, in their like blood cholesterol levels and stuff like that. So that's one thing people can do. The second thing is understand that it's quite flexible. So it was delaying and bringing forward relative to that individual's habitual breakfast time. So for some people that might be 8 o'clock. For some people it might be 7 o'clock. One thing we think is starting to become clear from the research is that eating more of your total daily energy early in the day seems to be a good idea, particularly for blood glucose regulation. By earlier in the day, we don't necessarily mean breakfast, right? So some studies have, and culturally it's different as well. So some studies,
definitely,
right, are in populations where people will consume really high energy breakfasts and then have a kind of medium-sized dinner and a medium-sized lunch and a small dinner. There's other studies though where people consume a kind of moderate breakfast and have their main caloric intake in the middle of the day.
Okay.
And some of those interventions in Spanish populations, for example, where they might have that kind of, or the French, where they have a breakfast, but it's lighter, and then their big meal is early in the day, and we think generally having most of your daily energy or the bulk of it before say 3 p.m. 4 p.m. may be good, and that doesn't have to be. And again, trying to have an element of practicality for people. that doesn't have to be eating everything at breakfast. You know, it could be lighter breakfast, bigger lunch, bigger breakfast, lighter lunch. Suit yourself in that sense. But the pattern that we are thinking we would recommend people avoid or try to is what the pattern that is typical in the UK population, which is just increasing energy over the course of the day and having the bulk of daily energy coming in the evening. We don't think that's necessarily conducive to metabolic health over the long term. In terms of putting some more concrete times on this, because evening can be a broad definition.
Well, I was going to ask you, like, how do you change this based on like now?
Right.
So, like, 6 months' time, my daytime hours increase. So does that mean I'm allowed to eat later? When it's like at its optimum and my daytime finishes at 9:30, does that mean I'm allowed to eat at 9:30? But then now, because the sun goes down at 5 to 4, that means I have to be finished eating at 3:30. How does that work?
So you don't have to change it to that extreme, because the way that circadian rhythms work is they're inherently tied to the 24-hour day. So yes, they have a degree of flexibility and can shorten and lengthen and can adapt, which we know they can adapt because you get over jet lag if you fly from here to Sydney. You're bollocks for a few days, but like you'll get over it, right? And then, so no, because they're tied to the 24-hour day, that rhythmicity every day will be roughly the same. So you don't need to stop eating at 3:30 in the winter because it's dark at 4, or stop eating at 10. Generally speaking, those internal rhythms are still going to be running along the same kind of periodicity. So, generally speaking, it seems that energy intake after 8 p.m. seems to be quite problematic. Another kind of habit that people in the general population seem to fall into is, even if they have dinner earlier, they still have a lot of calorie intake coming after dinner. And one of the benefits of time restricted eating is you simply just give yourself that cutoff point. And so, generally speaking, trying to avoid energy intake after 8 p.m., trying to have maybe a 2-hour period between last meal and going to bed, you know, and giving yourself that little bit of a fast into going to bed. And there's, although it's not quite clear yet, there's some suggestion that it may help with general sleep quality, and that when people go to bed very full, they might have less restful sleep because they're actively digesting. And so bringing dinner forward to a generally earlier period, let's say broadly speaking between, say, 5 and 8 might be good. Delaying breakfast could be good if people eat early. Generally speaking, a window of eating that I think is accessible for most people in the population is 10 or 11 hours. And that gives people a flexibility. And having your biggest meals earlier in the day, whether that's breakfast or lunch or between both breakfast and lunch, but having that kind of bulk of the energy earlier in the day, they seem to be recommendations that we can make now on the basis of what research is there, thinking that yes, you will generally improve your kind of overall metabolic health. And the thing is, a lot of this stuff might be independent of weight loss as well, like the improvements in your cholesterol or blood pressure or blood glucose tolerance. You know, all of those things can be improved with time restricted feeding without weight loss, which I think is a positive. But a lot of people do find they do lose weight simply because shortening the window means they just simply eat less. Right? Yeah, they just simply eat less, and particularly with discretionary calories. You know, that's the kind of thing that tends to, particularly in the evening, go out the window. So people end up having just a good dinner, like a meal, but they're not just eating way into the biological night then after they've had their dinner. And I think in the UK population, when we look at patterns of energy intake, that's a big one. Right? People just eat quite late. They eat. The average in the UK is people eat 46% of their total daily energy in the evening. Nearly half of their daily energy intake is coming at night, right? Okay. So that's probably not ideal over the long term.
So there are a million obviously a million questions that can be asked when you sort of interrelate these things. Like I'm thinking, like I know a guy who once advised me from like a food perspective. Let's say I know that my I forget the term now, but the amount of calories I burn each day just to survive, even if I don't exercise, baseline rate is like X. So then I know that I work out like 5 days a week, and my therefore my daily food allowance is, let's say, 3,000 calories.
Right.
And I get to 8 o'clock at night and I'm like, I've got 1,000 calories left, but I care about my training, my recovery, I want to gain muscle, and I've got a training session the next morning. He'd be like, look, man, if you've got 500 calories left at the end of the day, don't stress about it if it's chocolate or if it's pizza or if it's McDonald's or whatever, because you need those calories if you're training hard.
Right.
But then when you factor that thought process into, I don't want to eat past 8 o'clock, the question becomes, well, if I get to 8 o'clock and I've still got 1,000 calories left, am I just going to have to write that off as a bad day and make my decisions the next day based on that? Or do I go, well, do you know what? No, screw it. I'm going to order Domino's as well as my tea I just had half an hour ago. Do you know what I mean?
So I think that's a great question. I've had this conversation with other people kind of in the field, and with a good friend of mine that understands this research really well. And for athletes, we do think that there is some leeway that has to be made. People with really high energy demands because of their athletic pursuit are not the general population. True. So the advice that I'm giving there is for the general population who maybe have just been struggling with X diet, then Y diet, then A diet, then B diet, and they're just diet hopping from the next bullshit they've read in the Daily Mail, and they're a bit frustrated, and they just kind of want, and this is about how can we give people simple behaviors to adopt. The thing I like about time-restricted feeding is not a diet, it's just a set of behaviors. Shorten your eating window, eat dinner earlier, have most of your energy in the first couple of meals of the day. Like that's behavioral. I nothing I said there was like eat kale, like,
no, hell no. So, and nothing you said there is particularly controversial either. Like, you know what I mean? It's just pretty simple. And that's what I like about that kind of advice.
Yeah. But when it comes to athletes, there is a difference. Athletes do have energy requirements. What I generally would say is that I think if an athlete gets to the end of their day and has 1,000 calories left, they've badly managed their dietary structure for that day.
100%, yeah.
What I would generally say is we know from research that you don't necessarily need additional carbohydrates to maximize muscle protein synthesis. So because I've had this question before on another podcast from someone that was a CrossFitter and trained in the evening. It was the only time they got to train was like 7 o'clock. And by the time they got home, it was like 9:30. And they said, well, what do I do? And I said, well, have you had the bulk of your energy intake up to that training session that day? Well, then you're good, So my advice generally then was when you come home, have a high protein, but low carbohydrate and fat based kind of snack meal. And that will be sufficient to kickstart muscle protein synthesis and recovery from your workout without throwing in a boatload of calories at 9:30 p.m. So come home and have a good bowl of like Greek yogurt and some fruit, non-fat Greek yogurt and some fruit, or have make a shake in the blender with some protein powder and some frozen berries and a banana or something like that. Something that's kind of high protein, isn't heaping on the additional carbs and fat, and just have that and go to bed. Because you still have the bulk of your energy, your total calorie intake that day has come in that day, and you've still gotten adequate protein intake to stimulate your recovery processes and support muscle protein synthesis while you sleep. And then you get up and start all over again, have your big breakfast, have your high protein, high carb breakfast, whatever it is, and off you go. So generally, that's kind of the advice I give to athletes who train in the evening is plan your day so you have the bulk of your energy intake leading up to your session. Have a high protein based snack after your session, before going to bed, and then get up and back on it the next day. Then if going back to your example, if an athlete's got to 9 o'clock and they have 1,000 calories left, they've just badly managed that day.
Do you know what, to be fair, like I did when I asked the question, you framed it like really, really well, your answer. I wasn't even necessarily thinking about people who are like professional athletes.
No, not even professional. Like even recreational.
Yeah, but even no, I was going to say a typical person. Then it doesn't mean you haven't badly managed your day. I still would have badly managed my day. I've got 1,000 calories left.
I've got 1,000 calories left at 9 o'clock.
So, last question, and then I was going to wrap things up together. But I was thinking about two things. So one kind of specific from what would a shift worker do, and then the second one was I'd read. Not all of, but some of Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep. Mm-hmm. And I learned, apparently, it is a genetic thing to have morning larks and night owls.
Night owls.
And I didn't realize this. I genuinely put my hands up. I thought that if you're a person that says, I don't do mornings, it's just a decision to not quote unquote do mornings. But apparently that's not the case.
No.
How does shift workers and people that are morning larks or night owls, like whatever, how do we mold those things together? Because I think of my dad as a shift worker. He used to do a week of 6-2, a week of 2 till 10, and then a week of 10 till 6.
Right.
And his body
10 p.m. till 6 a.m.
Yes.
Right.
So 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., and 10 p.m. till 6 a.m. And his body was going through the ringer doing that.
Absolute
I think
ringer.
people understand now.
So shift work is, and it's a bit of an interest of mine. I'm hoping to get funding for a study looking at a nutrition strategy for night shift workers this year.
There's a lot of people that do it, right?
Right. So we live in 24-hour societies. We need shift workers, whether that's policemen, medical professionals, people in toll booths, there's so many niches.
Even the guys that clean our streets while we're asleep, you know what I mean, or whatever it is, crazy, everything.
So shift work isn't going anywhere, but right now our support for them, whether it's in terms of recommendations for sleep or even recommendations for diet, are so substandard and frankly relatively unacceptable given the risk that we know that shift work poses to people's long-term health. There is absolutely no sugarcoating that shift work over the long term has really adverse consequences for people's health. People are at massively increased risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. That's independent of even weight gain. And it's because of this constant disconnect between our circadian rhythms. So they're living in a constant state of circadian dysregulation. And there's no getting around that. What we need to do is invest a bit more in research to help improve strategies to mitigate those factors. So for shift workers, what I typically try and recommend is two things, depending on how stressful their kind of shift environment is. One is, do have a big dinner. So we're talking about not having big dinners, but this is different because you're going to be awake until 6, 7, 8 a.m. Have a big dinner and try not to eat a lot during the biological night, and then have breakfast when you come home the next morning and then go to bed. And that at least keeps your meal times somewhat aligned to the daytime, even though you're working night shifts. Yeah. Now, when I've had that conversation with people, for example, that work in the police or nurses, and they're on stressful enough jobs, and there's someone's come into A&E with a knife hanging out of them at 2 a.m, they're environments where it's very easy for me to say, oh, don't eat. But if they go back into the shift room and there's donuts there, why would you not have a donut, right? Oh. So there's a big psychosocial component to eating during night shift work that I think we should be mindful of as well. What I typically try and say to people is just don't try to avoid foods that are really high in both carbohydrate and fat at the same time, because they're the two types of nutrients that your body's going to really struggle with processing during the biological night. And because you've consumed high amounts of them together, it's just a bit of a shitstorm for the body to try and deal with at 2 a.m.
do that. Yeah.
Right. So try and have smaller snacks, stuff that might keep the wolf at bay. Like, even one of like a grenade bar, something like that, that like gives you that kind of chocolate hit, but is more like a protein bar basically, and an apple, or a handful of almonds, for example, or foods that are quite filling that aren't necessarily
nutritious, dense calories.
yeah, and it's not, because with the things, with hyper palatable foods like donuts and chocolate and stuff, it's just easy to have one and then have three, particularly in a stressful environment, right? So generally speaking, with shift workers, ideal scenario, just have a big dinner, try not to eat during the night, have breakfast, go to bed. More realistic scenario, still have that big dinner, and then just try and be conscious of your snack choices during the night, and maybe have a grenade bar or something like that, or some satiating fruit like an apple or something like that, and a grenade bar, and like that might fill things up. And try to avoid the foods that are generally kind of like quite high in fat and sugar and starch together. I think that's really right now. That's the
generally good advice. Full stop, though. That is, isn't it? Do you know what
I mean?
It
is, but particularly during the biological night. The other thing then is to just try and be mindful of all the light stuff we were talking about earlier. So when your period of shift work has ended, trying to, for the next couple of days, just really be mindful of getting back on a regular cycle, maximizing that outdoor light exposure, trying to go to bed a bit earlier in the evening, being really careful with the evening light exposure. Just have your rooms softly lit with side lighting. Don't try to be mindful of bedtime hygiene, and things like that. The second part of that question, which is the fascinating thing, is what they call chronotype. So previously, there was a lot of this idea that it was noted in research and in behaviors that some people have a personal time of day preference for getting up earlier, and some people don't, and some people have a preference for functioning a bit later into the night. And I think what really clouded this was the era from, say, 2008, 9 onwards. There was this explosion of like the self-made, self-help type 4-hour work week and all this stuff, and a lot of it's been positive, but there's a narrative within all of that stuff that is like, win the morning, win the day. You just set your, the Jocko Willings type stuff.
It's
like,
about stage
I'm up at 4:30, and I'm like, yeah, and you'll probably get dementia. So as heroic as that seems right now, it's also the most idiotic stuff I see on Instagram day in, day out. Like, there's nothing heroic about curtailing everything we know about sleep research. There is nothing heroic about getting up at 4:30 a.m. unless you're an extreme morning type.
Yeah,
and they are genetically a minor subset of the population. So maybe Jocko is. I don't know. But the idea that I do that, there's a lot of pontificating that comes with the whole like win the morning crowd, because if you're genetically a morning type, it's very easy for you to turn around and say, well, I do. Like, I remember
I used to do this before I read Matthew Walker's book. I'll put my hands up. I used to think if you didn't go up in the morning, you're just being lazy.
Right.
But that's how I feel.
Right.
If I remember being on holiday with parents, like abroad as a teenager, getting up at midday and like wasting 4 hours of a beautiful place.
Yeah.
If I get up at 9 now, I'm
feel
like,
guilty.
just so devastated. Like, I can't stand it. Like, I'm like, because the problem is, well, you get up at 9 and you take the same 2 hours to get into your day. So it's freaking 11 o'clock.
I know,
like,
exactly.
I like being up at 7. 7 is good.
Yeah. So one thing about the teenagers, which we used to always do, lazy teens. Teenagers have a natural phase delay in their circadian rhythms. It's really interesting. From about puberty, from the age of give or take 11 or 12 to about 20, there's a delay in adolescent circadian rhythms. So they genuinely are not lazy teens sleeping till 11 a.m. That's their chronotype for that period of their life stage. And some really interesting stuff recently, research has looked at that, because we basically rip kids out of bed at 6 a.m. to get them to school. That's their midpoint of sleep. And a couple of schools in the UK and in the US, as a experiment, pioneered starting the school day at 10 a.m. or 10:30, and the difference in their test scoring was night and day, because you're actually allowing them get all of the benefits of sleep and extended sleep on memory consolidation and stuff like that. So I think as a society, we can start to think a bit more about structuring, moving away from this very industrial revolution 9 to 5 framework of like a workday.
Yeah, that's not
And
2019, is it?
it's not 2019. And so for adults, then, once you come out of that phase shift in your adolescence, for adults, there's generally speaking, yes, like you said, morning larks or night owls. There is a genetic component to that. And that genetic component is also a behavioral preference. The vast majority of the population are neutral. They're not really an extreme to one or the other. So there can be a degree of behavioral preference for those kinds of individuals. And of course, these factors are also slightly modifiable. So for a lot of people in the population, here's a really interesting thing. In the research over the last 10 or 20 years, the proportion of people that identify as evening types has increased significantly. And that's probably to do with the fact of artificial light exposure at night. And behaviorally, people are identifying as an evening type because of these, these shifts that are happening, because they sleep later, they want to get up later, and all of these factors. So there are definite, because a lot of people struggle still with that kind of general self-help advice of like, oh my God, if I'm not up in the morning, I'm like a loser. And I'm like, and I'm really banging on a drum now when I talk to people about this. Like, no, you manage your day based on your rhythms, and don't get sucked into thinking you have to be up at 6 a.m. because that wins the day for you. If you suck in the morning, then you suck in the morning. Like, sleep and structure. Now, that's very easy to say for people who are self-employed. A lot of companies are, the kind of like more modern, like the kind of Google, Facebook kind of model of companies are starting to actually take account of this, and they're allowing people self-select time. But you still get, a lot of the traditional professions like your banks and your accountancy firms and blah, 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 they just still like, right. Yeah. Well, no, like, we were in Ireland. I was lucky because we're a smaller jurisdiction. So barristers are all self-employed.
Okay.
So, generally speaking, you had a degree of flexibility because court never like it started at 10 a.m. So yeah, like you could get up at like 8:30 if you wanted to, so, but we need to be thinking about this stuff a bit more. I think people need to try and, so for anyone that's listening that's like, oh my God, like you'll freely find what's known as the Munich Chronotype questionnaire if you just Google it. And the Munich Chronotype questionnaire is the best available questionnaire tool we have to establish your chronotype, your preference. It can also help you calculate a thing called social jet lag, which is the difference between the sleep you get on the weekdays when you have to get up for work versus the sleep you would get on the weekend when you're able to self-select your sleep time and sleep according to your need a bit more. And social jet lag is emerging as a thing that may be somewhat of an issue in people that have high levels of it, because they're basically constantly disconnecting themselves during the week, because they might be an evening type, but they have to wake up at 5:30 because they need to be out of the house at 6 for an hour commute to be in the office for 7, right? So they're the people that are most disadvantaged by society's current professional working life structures, are evening types, because we're basically fitting them into a morning type world.
Walker talks about, isn't it?
Yeah. And so I think it is something to be mindful of. If you are a real evening type, I guess see how flexible your employer is willing to be with allowing you to kind of modify. It's the thing Tim Ferriss talked about in the 4-Hour Workweek, right? It's like, go to them and be like, hey, let's try this experiment, and if I'm more productive, we'll keep going with it. Like,
nothing to be lost with asking a question, is there?
Right. Well, ask the question, and I think a lot of companies now let people work from home a lot more once they're like logged into whatever system they have or are online. And, I think yeah, just generally taking account of those things. Like I'm kind of generally speaking more a morning than an evening type person, but I also have because I guess I think in rhythms all the time. I can't not think about this shit anymore. So I've noticed little like subtle things like in the morning, like when I'm up and about, because I so much of my day-to-day life is writing. Like I'm constantly writing. I'm writing a research article. I'm writing for my own website. I'm constantly writing. But I used to always think again from the kind of self-help books. You know, it's like, oh, Stephen King writes 2,000 words every morning before breakfast. Tim Ferriss loves that one, right? So I was like, oh my God, I have to do that. And then I'd be like, but I am shit in the morning at writing. What
Yeah.
I'm good at in the morning is like reading. I'm good at like sitting down with a pile of research papers and reading through them, and my brain kind of being a bit more analytical and kind of like logical. And then I get into the afternoon, and that's when I can write really well.
It's
So,
also the fact that giving yourself the opportunity to learn that awareness, isn't it?
right.
Like, wouldn't you say, like, for example, from a diet perspective? In fact, I remember someone saying to me once about how much water he said you should drink. And that's not the operative point, was that he said that most people don't know what it feels like to be hydrated.
Right.
Most people don't know what it feels like to feel healthy from
Right.
like a dietary perspective. So if you just take some time to just be really good, like that's what the 4 hour body taught me, like the slow carb diet. Like I ate great 6 days out of 7. And that cheat day became less and less enjoyable as I
Enjoyable.
progressed, because for then 2 days afterwards, I felt like death
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
eating crap for a
Right,
day.
right,
And you
right,
begin to go, actually, I feel quite good when I eat well, rather than
right,
just the
right.
momentary pleasure of a McDonald's or a half a tub of Ben and Jerry's. Do you know what I
It was
mean?
also the fact that the slow carb diet not just encouraged like, oh hey, like, you know, eat your it was the sheer gluttony that was just encouraged on that day. It was like deliberately overfeed yourself
Mm-hmm.
beyond the level of comfort.
Yeah.
It was a little bit disordered.
I
I'm
went
not gonna
whole hog
lie.
when I first started doing it. Like
Right.
a friend of mine that did the diet after I did and saw my impressive results
Right.
used to see how many pounds he could gain the day after he weighed himself on cheat day.
Same.
um, Alan, I am conscious of wanting to kind of wrap things up together, and wanted just to give you an opportunity to let people know where they can find you. You've been extremely informative and entertaining. Like I've had a great time talking to you. An hour and 11 minutes has gone
Yeah, yeah,
like
great.
that.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking for people, your Instagram is perhaps the best place. So I had to scroll through a couple of times leading up to today.
Yeah.
Um, and didn't, like I said to you, I didn't want to take too much to influence today's conversation. I hope you
Right.
feel that's worked out quite well.
Yeah,
Because
it was great. I like the rabbit holes.
yeah, but I think you do an awesome job on your Instagram of breaking down the kind of things that you learn day to day, which people like me, I'd switch off, and
Right.
making it informative, entertaining, actionable for people. So your Instagram is
At the nutritional_advocate.
um,
And yeah, it's very much a page where I'm trying to be the kind of best science communicator that I can. So it's very much science focused, but trying to make what that's saying accessible to people,
and I
and so
found
they
that.
can understand it. Yeah, yeah. And so I tend to not post regularly. I tend to do focus mostly on just putting together kind of more informative stories. And because with a post, you're kind of limited by A, the word count, B, the algorithm. Whereas with stories, you can really flesh out the point you're trying to make and take the time to explain it in a bit more detail. And yeah, it's been good. Kind of building a following of people that are definitely interested in the science side of things, and wanting to understand that more.
It's a conversation for another day for me to ask you about that, because you've got a solid following, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah,
The
most of that was
website
built
is
offline. The website is alineanutrition.com, so ALINEA nutrition.com, and that is very science focused. It's in terms of kind of um, I've been very much aiming it at kind of nutrition professionals. It's a research review focused website where we kind of like dismantle studies, recent studies. What do they say? What's the application for practice?
Did you dismantle Game Changers by any chance?
I kind of did one or two things, but I just wasn't bothered, because when you spend time in nutrition, you realize that a lot of what's happening with diet is belief system driven, not science driven. So Game Changers, everyone that follows a vegan diet, Game Changers just confirmed their own bias, and they were able to smash it around the internet saying, see, told you so. And then for everyone that is against vegan diets, it just became a tool to try and bash and disprove everything that was in it. And it was just a conversation I didn't really want to be involved in at all.
Fair point. So last question. If anybody wants to find out a little bit more regarding time-restricted feeding, like if I wanted to stay up to date with what's going on, but I'm not going to read a scientific paper, is there anywhere that you would recommend, like other than your Instagram?
Well, certainly my Instagram will be a place. Danny Lennon wrote an incredible article for the website Stronger by Science on chrononutrition. So if anyone's interested, definitely go to that website for that article. And it gives a great overview of where we're at right now with the research. And in terms of where else, I mean,
we'll leave it at your Instagram.
Yeah. That's it.
Cool. Alan, thank you so much for doing this. Like, I appreciate that all this really was, somebody recommended me speak to you, and then you've been willing to give me an hour and 15 minutes of your time. Like, honestly, I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I think there's lots left to talk about. So another time in the future, I can pin you down, and we can go from there.
Yeah, it'll be a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Man, thank you very much.
Cheers.
This is Dan Ball from Wellness Academy. I really hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. You'll find a link on the episode notes. Just tap or swipe over the cover art. You'll also see some offers from our sponsor, Lichfield Apart Hotel. Find them at lichfieldaparthotel.com, and we hope you'll support our show by supporting them. If you like what you've heard, we'd love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe. Another way to support us is to answer a short survey at yourwellnessacademy.co.uk/survey and tell us what wellness topics you'd like to hear about. I'm your host, Dan Ball. Our producer is Scott Towns, created by our executive producer, Ben Heathcote for Wellness Academy.